Noah Harper wasn't the type to chase conflict, especially not over land. He had bought his plot on the edge of a suburban development through a quiet municipal auction. No banners, no bids, just paperwork and patience. The land itself wasn't much to look at. Rocky, a little wild, flanked by overgrown brush and resting just beyond the edge of a community that prided itself on conformity. But to Noah, it was peace. After decades working in soil science and agriculture consultancy, the land offered a kind of silence he hadn't felt in years. He kept his work modest, cleared a strip for native pollinators, planted some hybrid fruit trees, and used the rest for trials in drought-resistant crops. It was practical, lawful, and his, fully deeded, with no contractual ties to the neighboring residential association that governed the homes beyond his fence. At first, no one cared what he was doing. The lot had been empty for years, and the neighbors had likely gotten used to treating it as an extension of their own territory. A place for dog walking, shortcutting, or letting their kids explore. But when Noah put up a clear, tasteful boundary fence and signs marking the land as private agricultural use, the tone shifted. It wasn't aggressive at first, just lingering glances, a few passive remarks when he passed by the small communal mailbox area near the main road. He'd nod, offer a polite hello, and move on. He had no interest in policing anyone's opinion of him. The first pile of trash showed up after a long weekend. It wasn't random, bagged neatly as though it belonged to a regular pickup cycle. Noah assumed someone had gotten confused, maybe a temporary sanitation mix-up or a delivery mistake. He moved it to the edge of his lot and called the city services to verify schedules. They hadn't changed. Over the next few weeks, however, the pattern repeated. Each Monday morning, without fail, new piles appeared. Household waste, discarded food containers, garden clippings, always in the same spot along his property line that bordered the back of the neighboring development. It wasn't until he found a stack of flattened boxes with the residential association's emblem, stylized, stamped, and neatly folded, that he understood it wasn't accidental. Someone from the community was intentionally treating his land like a dumping ground. Noah wasn't naive. He knew land disputes rarely started with yelling. They started exactly like this. Quiet erasure, small violations, testing how much someone would tolerate before pushing back. He didn't react immediately. Instead, he began documenting everything. Dates, photos, even weight estimates of what was being left behind. He logged the materials, identified brands on packaging, and cross-referenced them with recycling records from the nearby blocks. There was a pattern, and patterns meant intent. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he was preparing for one. Noah wasn't someone easily provoked, but he believed in boundaries, not just physical, but ethical. He kept his head down, lived modestly, and treated others with quiet respect. That made the moment he caught the first real confirmation of his suspicion all the more infuriating. It was a Tuesday afternoon, overcast and sluggish, the kind of day that wrapped everything in a blanket of gray. He had returned early from a supply run, planning to transplant seedlings before the weather turned. As he pulled into the gravel drive that led to his property, he noticed a small electric maintenance vehicle idling at the edge of the back lot. The vehicle was unmarked, save for a fading sticker on the door. A vaguely official-looking crest he had seen once or twice near the association's clubhouse bulletin board. The driver was a thick-set woman in her late 50s, with a flustered, red-cheeked face and white sneakers that didn't quite match the business-casual attire above them. Her movements were hurried but methodical. She was lifting bags, identical black plastic bags to the ones he'd been finding, and tossing them over the low section of his fence like someone feeding meat to dogs. When she turned, Noah saw her face clearly. It was the woman who often stood behind the podium at the nearby monthly board meetings, Karen Mason, the residential association's president. She spotted him too late. Her eyes widened, her mouth opened in a slack shape of alarm, but she didn't offer an apology or even a guilty smile. Instead, she yanked the handle of the cart, spun it around on two wheels, and accelerated down the access road behind the development like it was a race and she was already late. Noah stood frozen for a moment, more stunned by the audacity than by the act itself. She had not only trespassed, she had done it with the precision and confidence of someone who'd done it many times before. It wasn't an accident. It was policy, or at least practice. That night, Noah did what any reasonable man would do. He printed the photos, documented the time, date, weather conditions, and direction of the vehicle. He took samples of the new waste bags, sorted them, and recorded the contents. Among them was a sheet of printed minutes from a recent board meeting, complete with highlighted maintenance budget items and Karen Mason's signature at the bottom. The message was clear. They weren't just dumping trash. They were reallocating waste management responsibility by quietly and illegally shifting it onto a neighbor who had no legal ties to them. Still unwilling to escalate recklessly, Noah took the materials to a local attorney who specialized in land use law. The attorney, a calm and seasoned man named Brent Calloway, reviewed the folder carefully, pausing occasionally to nod or raise an eyebrow. He confirmed what Noah had suspected. While the act of dumping waste on private property was a misdemeanor, the repeated nature of it, especially if performed by a representative of a formal organization, could be framed as environmental violation and illegal transfer of municipal burden. Brent recommended a two-tier approach. First, Noah would file an official complaint with the city sanitation department, citing environmental concerns and illegal dumping. Second, they would submit a notice of trespass to the board, signed and notarized, to be formally delivered by courier with acknowledgement of receipt. The next day, Noah followed through. The sanitation department responded with interest, promising to send a field agent within 72 hours. The trespass notice was delivered to the board office, and though no direct acknowledgement came, the confirmation of delivery was signed, in sloppy, looping cursive, by Karen Mason herself. For a few days, nothing happened. No new trash, no sudden appearances, no unexpected visitors. Noah hoped, albeit cautiously, that the message had been received and understood. Maybe it was over. Then came the letter. Thick envelope, no return address. The name Noah Harper typed in all caps. He opened it cautiously. Inside was a single sheet of heavyweight paper, cream-colored, with the same dull gold crest from the electric cart stamped at the top. The message was short, almost casual in tone, but the subtext was venomous. It read, "Dear Mr. Harper, we regret to inform you that your recent complaints regarding property conditions adjacent to our community have been noted. As a reminder, community harmony is best achieved through cooperation and compromise. Continued obstruction of neighborhood sanitation efforts may result in corrective actions. Sincerely, the board." Corrective actions. Noah read the phrase several times. It sounded like a threat, thinly veiled in formality. Not only had they refused to acknowledge their wrongdoing, they had doubled down, presenting their illegal dumping as some kind of shared responsibility. There was no apology, no promise to stop, only a threat dressed in pleasantries. Noah folded the letter slowly and set it aside. He wasn't furious, not yet, but he felt something else, colder and more focused. Resolve. They weren't going to stop on their own, not unless he gave them a reason to. Noah knew that the game had shifted. The trash was no longer the problem. It was the tactic. They had pushed. He had pushed back. And now they were tightening the screws in subtler ways. It didn't take long for the pressure to escalate. The next week brought two new developments. First, a notice was taped to the old utility pole at the intersection where his property line met the edge of the residential complex. It had no seal, no city emblem, just bold black letters on standard printer paper. Unauthorized dumping zone. Violators will be fined. Noah tore it down and kept it. It was unsigned, unofficial, and blatantly reversed the actual truth, but it was clever. By suggesting that he was the one violating regulations, they were laying the groundwork for something deeper. Perception management. If enough neighbors believed it, the truth wouldn't matter. Noah recognized the move. Frame your opponent before he can frame you. The second change was more invasive. One morning, just after sunrise, he found a city sanitation worker in a reflective vest, photographing the edge of his property. The worker claimed he was conducting a follow-up environmental survey, though he couldn't produce a work order or even a clear reason for the visit. When pressed, the man muttered something about public complaints and walked back to his vehicle without offering a name. That same afternoon, Noah received a letter from the Department of Environmental Health requesting a voluntary inspection of his property to assess potential code violations related to waste management. The timing wasn't coincidental, and Noah didn't need proof to understand the source. Karen Mason and her board weren't just dumping garbage anymore. They were using their community clout, weaponizing bureaucracy to paint him as the offender, muddying the narrative until officials stopped asking who was telling the truth and simply acted on appearances. Noah didn't panic. He responded to the inspection request by inviting the agency on his terms, providing them with a clear digital record of the origin, volume, and composition of every batch of waste he'd documented. He also attached copies of the trespass notice and a certified statement from the attorney, noting that no waste was generated on the property itself and that any refuse had been placed there without his consent. The agency responded with a surprising clarity. The inspection was deferred pending further review, and the file was flagged for follow-up due to property owner dispute. It was the bureaucratic version of saying, "We're watching." But things weren't quiet for long. One afternoon, as Noah was trimming overgrowth near his irrigation lines, he noticed a man standing on the other side of the fence. Mid-30s, cargo vest, clipboard in hand, the kind of guy who looked like he belonged to a contractor crew but carried himself like a code enforcement officer. The man didn't introduce himself. He just stared for a long moment, then pointed at the northern fence post and asked, "That your permanent boundary?" Noah, still gripping his shears, replied calmly, "It's where the survey markers are. That's legal line." The man made a mark on his clipboard, turned, and walked off without another word. That evening, Noah found a flyer in his mailbox for a community vision plan meeting, hosted by the association. The agenda included a vague item labeled Border Beautification and Compliance Review. By now, the tactic was clear. They weren't going to confront him directly. They were trying to surround him, create a cloud of confusion, red tape, and rumors thick enough to make him fold, to make his presence feel like an inconvenience rather than a right. Noah had no plans to retaliate emotionally. He didn't rant on the internet or confront Karen in the street. Instead, he did something far more strategic. He reached out to a licensed waste management firm that operated under independent contract, unaffiliated with the city or the development. He arranged for the delivery of a large industrial roll-off container to be placed on the far side of his property, legally placed, properly signed, and visible from the association's rear fence line. He marked it with a laminated notice, "For collection and separation of illegally deposited materials pending review." That move had more impact than any lawsuit could. Within 48 hours, residents of the nearby homes started whispering. Someone even posted on the community message board that a private EPA case was underway. No one knew what the container was really for, but the mere presence of official-looking signage and a sealed contractor bin was enough to rattle nerves. Karen didn't respond in public. She didn't need to. Her next move was through the back door. 3 nights later, Noah awoke to the sound of gravel shifting. Not a car, not footsteps. Something mechanical. He slipped on boots, grabbed a flashlight, and made his way to the northern edge of his property. There, half submerged in the ditch that ran parallel to the fence, was a pile of new debris. Broken concrete chunks, insulation, and what looked like fragments of shelving or wall paneling. No vehicle in sight, no tire marks. But the weight and size of the dump meant it had been hauled by equipment, not by hand. The gravel near the fence was slightly disturbed, as though something heavy had backed up just far enough to unload. Noah stood silently in the dark, the flashlight beam frozen over the shattered drywall. He felt no anger, only clarity. They were testing him. Again. Seeing if he'd call the police, make a scene, or finally snap. He did none of those things. He didn't touch the debris. He logged the incident, took time-stamped photos, and called the same waste contractor. The next morning, the firm arrived with a front loader and added the debris to the roll-off container. The driver left without fanfare, just another job on the schedule. But the message was starting to spread. Noah wasn't their dumping ground. He was documenting everything, responding with precision, and escalating only through lawful channels they couldn't control. And the container? It was getting full. Not just with trash, but with leverage. The next development didn't come in the form of trash or anonymous letters. It came in silence. A week passed without any new garbage dumps, no strange visitors or coded inspections, and no notices stuffed into his mailbox. For a moment, Noah considered the possibility that the pressure campaign had collapsed under its own weight. The roll-off container on his property now stood nearly full, and although he'd made no attempt to contact the board again, the message had been clear enough. Every piece of garbage they dumped, every underhanded tactic they tried, was being Preserved and documented, not erased or cleaned up. It wasn't just a threat of exposure, it was a visible archive of their misconduct. Still, Noah knew better than to believe it was over. In his experience, people like Karen Mason didn't retreat. They regrouped. Sure enough, the next turn came not through force, but manipulation. A man knocked on his door late one morning, well-dressed, but with the uneasy charm of someone selling a lie he didn't believe in. He introduced himself as Michael Denton, a community liaison for residential relations. A title so vague it could mean anything. He claimed to represent a task group from the association that was interested in resolving tensions without formal litigation or escalation. He spoke carefully, using words like mutual understanding and long-term integration. But beneath the diplomatic surface was a clear offer. Noah could voluntarily donate a portion of his land for buffer development, a green space that would help improve the cohesion between private and residential zones. They were asking him to give up part of his own property to make the neighbors feel more comfortable, or more accurately, to justify their intrusion and cover up their abuse. Noah didn't yell. He didn't throw the man off his land. Instead, he let him speak, listened to every word, and when the pitch was done, simply asked, "Is this offer being made under duress or retaliation for a legal complaint?" Michael hesitated just a fraction too long, then smiled weakly and said, "No, of course not." Noah nodded, thanked him for the visit, and closed the door. Later that afternoon, he filed a memo of that conversation with his attorney, including time, date, and a transcript he had recorded, legally as state law permitted single-party consent. What Noah didn't expect came that weekend. Two residents from the development, a couple in their 60s he barely knew, visited the edge of his property while he was working. They didn't shout or accuse him of anything. Instead, they apologized. The woman wearing garden gloves and a frayed sun hat said quietly, "We didn't know what was going on. We just saw the notices and the mess and figured, well, that it was your mess. But we saw someone unloading furniture into the ditch 2 nights ago. My husband tried to call it in, but the truck was already gone." Her husband nodded, embarrassed. "I don't know what Karen told the rest of the board, but I can tell you this. Some people are getting real nervous, and not everyone's behind her." It wasn't exactly an alliance, but it was the first crack in the wall of silence. That evening, Noah updated his notes, then made a decision. He contacted a certified environmental lab and paid out of pocket to have them analyze the contents of the debris pile and soil around it. It wasn't cheap, but the results were worth it. 2 days later, the lab returned with elevated levels of lead, paint residues, and minor asbestos fibers in the older insulation dumped along his fence. The documentation was exact and impartial. Noah submitted it through his attorney to the county health department and to the municipal environmental oversight office. It wasn't just a report, but it was a chain of liability, one that tied back to the unauthorized dumping, documented with Karen's signature and timing. The association's response came swiftly and predictably. An emergency meeting was called. Residents were invited. Noah wasn't, but he didn't need to be. One of the attendees, the same woman from the fence line, emailed him afterward. She summarized what had happened. Karen tried to downplay the allegations, claimed the waste might have come from transient contractors or unauthorized third parties. But when residents asked how those unauthorized third parties had access to HOA-marked carts or why HOA waste bins had been disappearing for months, she couldn't answer. Someone even brought up Noah's container, asking directly, "If he's the one violating codes, why is he the only one paying to dispose of this stuff properly?" Noah received no apology. But he didn't need one. He could feel the balance shift. The trash stopped again, this time for good. The flyers disappeared. Even the strange liaison never returned. But most importantly, the silence around the issue had cracked. People were talking, asking questions Karen couldn't control. She could spin a story in meetings and send threatening letters, but she couldn't unspill the truth now that it had begun to spread on its own. And that container? Noah scheduled it for removal the following week, after photographing every item and sealing the report. He didn't need it anymore. It had served its purpose. Not just as storage for evidence, but as a monument to his refusal to be erased or intimidated. The ground was his, and now, finally, so was the upper hand. Noah had assumed that once the public pressure began to rise and the story around the waste shifted in his favor, the conflict would die down in its usual bureaucratic whimper. Meetings, memos, maybe the quiet removal of Karen Mason from her position and a few months of smug silence from the residents who once whispered behind their blinds. But what happened next confirmed something Noah had begun to suspect for weeks. Karen wasn't simply unfit to lead, she was terrified of losing control, and that made her desperate. The next escalation didn't come from letters or threats. It came from a tactic that blended malice with plausible deniability. The kind of move someone uses when they're no longer trying to win cleanly, but just trying to make you quit. It started with sound, sharp, jarring, unnatural noise late one night that jolted Noah from sleep. Not wildlife, not a passing truck, but something industrial. Short metallic scrapes, thudding impacts, the growl of machinery not meant to be there. He stepped outside barefoot and cold, flashlight already in hand, and caught the end of it. A flatbed truck retreating down the gravel easement with its tailgate rattling loose. The damage was immediate and undeniable. 3 new heaps of waste had been dumped just inside his boundary line, each positioned precisely to obstruct access. One in front of his main gate, one along the equipment shed, and the last directly atop his low-pressure irrigation valves. The piles were different this time, not bagged, not concealed. Just raw material, crumbling plasterboard, tangled rebar, crushed pallets, paint buckets, and tarps stiff with dried chemicals. It was the kind of debris that couldn't be explained as overflow or mistake. This was construction site runoff, illegal and dangerous. Noah stood there for nearly an hour doing nothing. Not from shock, but calculation. This was the moment most people cracked, when the sheer physical reality of what had been done to them pulled them into impulsive, reckless reaction. But he wasn't most people, and this wasn't the first time someone had tested his ability to hold the line. When the sun rose, he documented every inch, took soil samples, and called the contractor who had previously helped him haul the association's garbage. But this time, he made a second call, to the district supervisor of code enforcement. He didn't allege blame, he didn't offer theories. He submitted a neutral complaint. Illegal dumping of regulated construction waste on private property with potential environmental exposure. That framing did something critical. It bypassed the HOA narrative entirely. This wasn't about neighborhood squabbles anymore. This was about public health law. But Karen unsurprisingly responded in kind. 2 days after the complaint, Noah received an official cease and desist letter delivered by courier. The document accused him of unauthorized construction, claimed his presence was creating environmental risk to adjacent properties, and alleged persistent non-compliance with neighborhood harmony protocols. It was absurd on its face, filled with invented terminology and unsupported citations. But it had teeth. A list of fines totaling over $14,000 if he did not comply within 10 business days. Noah's attorney laughed when he saw it, calling it the legal equivalent of graffiti, but he advised caution. A baseless threat, if repeated often enough, could become a nuisance suit, and nuisance suits had a way of bleeding people dry through time and money. That evening, Noah sat in his workshop and considered his options. He wasn't interested in martyrdom. He wasn't interested in letting Karen bait him into a fight that played on her turf. But something had changed in the last 48 hours. He could feel it. The waste was more brazen, the response more aggressive, and the language of the board's letter wasn't just hollow bravado. It was designed to create a paper trail, one that could be weaponized later to allege that he had ignored formal warnings. It was, in essence, an attempt to build a narrative of negligence. So Noah decided to strike, not emotionally, not illegally, but with clarity and intent. He went down to the rental depot and signed for a mid-size backhoe loader. Legally rented, permitted for off-road movement, with a 36-hour return window. It arrived just before dawn the next day, delivered without questions. He didn't make a show of it. He simply fired up the engine, maneuvered the bucket into place, and began clearing the illegal debris with methodical precision. What didn't fit in the front loader, he strapped down in bundles. The job took nearly 6 hours. When it was done, he cleaned the area, reset the valves, and checked the fencing for damage. Then, in full view of several early morning dog walkers and a few stunned residents sipping coffee behind glass windows, Noah drove the backhoe into the development. Not recklessly, not with aggression. He followed the easement road legally permitted for utility access. He didn't destroy property. He didn't raise his voice. He simply rolled to the front of Karen Mason's driveway, positioned the loader over the edge, and gently dumped the entire pile of debris into a neat, contained stack directly across her garage doors. When it was done, he shut off the machine, placed a laminated tag atop the heap, and walked away. The tag read, "Material returned to sender. No charge for disposal." Karen called the police. Of course she did, but by the time they arrived, Noah had already returned the loader and provided both departments, sanitation and enforcement, with written statements, documentation, and environmental reports. The officers reviewed the site, read the printed logs, and informed Karen that since the debris could be traced to the same material under investigation for illegal dumping, and since Noah had taken care not to trespass or damage her property, no arrest would be made. Her threats of legal action fell flat. Her neighbors watched in silence. Some laughed quietly, others took photos. None stepped in. That evening, as the sun set over the edge of the development, Noah sat on the bench outside his shed and watched the stillness return. The message had been sent, not through shouting or retaliation, but through calm, measured action. He hadn't stooped to her level. He had simply held the mirror up and made sure everyone saw what it reflected. The fallout from Noah's precise and deliberate return of the debris was immediate, but not loud. Karen Mason didn't scream in the street, didn't storm down to his property, didn't issue a second wave of threats. Instead, she disappeared. For 4 days, no one saw her outside. The pile of waste remained unmoved on her driveway, shrinking slightly each morning as city sanitation workers removed it in stages, each visit recorded by a property maintenance crew with clipboards and tight expressions. The neighbors watched silently, none approaching, but none helping either. It was as though her authority had collapsed in full view of everyone, but no one wanted to be the first to acknowledge it aloud. What replaced her presence was a flurry of internal movement. Board members scheduling emergency meetings, legal counsel being quietly brought in, and residents whispering about replacements before anything had been formally announced. The association had not just been embarrassed, it had been exposed. And in a community built on image, exposure was the most unforgivable offense. Noah kept his distance from it all. He made no comments to the press, issued no public statements, and ignored the community gossip entirely. His focus remained on the land. The contaminated soil had been scraped and replaced. The irrigation was working again. His crops were intact. And more importantly, the space had returned to what it had always been meant to be: quiet, undisturbed, and free. But peace didn't mean the story was over. On the 5th day, he received a formal letter not from Karen or the board, but from the city's Environmental Enforcement Division. The letter was professional, calm, and direct. A review of the materials recovered from his property had confirmed the presence of multiple regulated compounds, including lead-based paints, solvent traces, and airborne fiber content from prohibited insulation. The investigation had progressed from administrative concern to formal violation status. The city had opened a case file for environmental abuse of non-permitted land and would be initiating an audit of all waste handling practices linked to the residential development. Attached to the letter was a list of requests. Names of individuals involved in waste management, collection schedules, inventory lists of disposal equipment, and records of construction approvals from the HOA's internal operations over the past year. Though Noah wasn't mentioned as a subject of scrutiny, he was identified as the primary complainant, and the city intended to use his documentation as evidence. Brent Calloway, his attorney, confirmed what Noah already suspected. Karen had lost control of the board, and now the investigation would peel back every decision she had made under the guise of community order. With the city involved, there would be no more vague warnings or passive-aggressive letters. There would be subpoenas, compliance checks, and fines measured not in hundreds but in tens of thousands. The association could attempt to shield itself under bylaws and internal policy, but environmental law was not something they could outvote. The real turning point, however, came the following week when an internal memo from the HOA, meant to remain private, was accidentally sent to a neighborhood mailing list. The memo detailed the board's awareness of unauthorized waste relocation and discussed possible ways to frame the incidents in a manner that would reduce perceived liability. It included suggestions like emphasizing mutual misunderstanding and presenting Mr. Harper's activities as provocational rather than evidentiary. That leak did what months of debris, threats, and legal pressure hadn't fully accomplished. It shattered the association's image of professionalism and fair governance in the eyes of the residents. People who had stayed neutral suddenly began to take sides. Those who had once deferred to Karen now questioned how long they'd been complicit. Karen herself was nowhere to be found when the city issued its first public update on the investigation. A single-page bulletin was posted at the local municipal website stating that a pending compliance action had been initiated, with penalties for improper disposal of hazardous materials in residential zones. Names weren't listed yet, but everyone knew who the notice was about. That same night, a new flyer appeared at the HOA's community center. This one unsigned, but with typed clarity that could not be mistaken for anything but fact. A vote to remove Karen Mason as board president will be held Friday at 6 p.m. All residents in good standing may attend. Noah didn't go. He didn't need to. He already knew how it would end. The people who once tried to weaponize silence against him were now using it against her. The same polite avoidance, the same neighborly distance. Only now Karen was on the receiving end. And just as she had refused to take responsibility in public, no one felt obligated to defend her in the same space. By the time the weekend arrived, Karen's name had been removed from the association directory. Her house lights remained off each night, the curtains drawn, her car absent from the driveway. No announcement was made, no apology was issued, just a vacancy where there once was control. Noah didn't celebrate. He didn't toast or cheer or breathe a dramatic sigh of relief. He returned to his workshop, pulled out the old binder filled with the first photos and maps he had drawn, and quietly logged the final incident. The last pile had been moved. The city was involved. The board was changing. But most importantly, the pattern had stopped. Not because someone told it to, but because someone had drawn a line and made it hold. The weeks that followed were quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar at first, as if the land itself were catching its breath after a long, bitter season. No new trash appeared. No letters, no clipboard men, no vague inquiries about permits or lines or ordinances. The sounds that filled Noah's property now were the ones he'd intended all along. The low hum of irrigation lines, the faint rustle of wind through young trees, the soft clink of tools being used for their proper purpose. The container had long been removed, the soil replaced, and the debris now logged as official evidence in an active municipal case. He no longer had to watch his perimeter like a soldier. He could simply work. One morning, while checking the south fence, he noticed something strange. The old handmade sign he had posted months ago, "Private property, do not dump," had been removed. In its place was a newer placard, mounted cleanly and bolted into the fence post. It was stamped with the city's seal and read in formal serif font, "Environmental Watch Site, protected by municipal order." It wasn't something Noah had requested, nor had he been informed. It was a silent acknowledgement, like a message that his stand had been seen, recorded, and, in some way, respected by the very agencies that once might have ignored him. He took a picture, not to share, but to remember. The development board restructured quietly. A new acting president was appointed, someone Noah didn't know, but who hadn't appeared on his property or near his fence. The remaining board members sent a short, formal notice through his attorney. They acknowledged the past conflict, recognized his legal standing, and stated that all future correspondence would be routed through the city when necessary. No apology, but no more threats either. It was bureaucracy's version of surrender. Clinical, careful, and absolute. One afternoon in late spring, Noah stood at the edge of his garden with a cup of coffee in one hand and pruning shears in the other. A young couple from the development strolled by on the easement path, paused for a moment, and the woman gave him a small wave. Not a thank you, not a conversation starter, just a gesture. He nodded back. That was enough. He didn't need validation. He didn't need recognition. The point had never been to win some imagined war. It had been to keep what was his, to refuse to be erased and to prove, without shouting, without violence, and without folding, that standing firm could still mean something in a world that too often rewarded noise over substance. The fence still stood. The ground had healed. And as Noah clipped a low branch from the lemon sapling near the gate, he smiled faintly, not at victory, but at the simple fact that he was still there, and no one else's trash ever would be again.